This is the story of the 1972 Chicago O'Hare collision. Most people think that the threat of an accident is over once you're safely on the ground. That's generally the case, but in some rare cases, accidents still can happen. This is exactly what happened in the case of the 1972 Chicago O'Hare runway disaster. On the 20th of December 1972, above the skies of Chicago, Delta Airlines Flight 954, a Convair 880, was on its way from Tampa, Florida to Chicago. The Convair 880 contacted Chicago Approach Control. They got to know that runway 14 right was being used for landings, and 14 left and right were being used for departures. Soon afterward, the controller comes on the frequency to let all planes know that planes under his watch would now be vectored onto runway 14 left. With visibility around 3,000 feet, it seems that this would be another routine landing. Having received their approach clearance, Flight 954 contacted the local controller at 5:52 p.m. The local controller gave Flight 954 permission to land on runway 14 left. At this point, the visibility, or RVR, had dropped to 1,800 feet. At 5:55 p.m., the controller asked Flight 954 to report when clear of the runway. After the plane landed safely, the controller transferred them over to ground control. At 5:57 p.m., Flight 954 contacted the ground controller after a first failed attempt. He says, "Delta 954 is with you, inside the bridge, and we gotta get to the box." The controller replies with, "Okay, if you can just pull over to the 32 pad." The co-pilot responds with, "Okay, we'll do it." The controller makes a note to himself, reminding himself that he had sent the Convair 880 to pad 32 right, where they'd wait for a gate assignment. As this was happening, at another end of the airport, another plane was getting ready to fly. Flight 575 was a DC-9 that was flying from Chicago to Duluth, Minnesota, with 41 passengers on board the DC-9. They were looking forward to a relatively short flight. At 5:50 p.m., the DC-9 got clearance from the ground controller to hold short of runway 27 left for departure. 8 minutes later, the controller cleared the plane onto the runway. With visibility at 1/4 of a mile, the crew would have to be on their toes during this takeoff. At 5:59 p.m., after having received his takeoff clearance, the crew pushes the throttles forward as the DC-9 starts its takeoff roll down runway 27 left. With the co-pilot in charge of the takeoff and the captain supervising the takeoff, the captain calls out, "Rotate," as the plane barrels down the runway. Right as he made the call out, the captain made out a plane in the fog right in front of them. Flight 954 had taxied onto the runway and was now right in front of the DC-9. The captain helped the co-pilot to lift the plane off the runway in an attempt to clear the Convair 880. This was their only hope, as they were traveling too fast for them to stop the plane in time. But it was too late. The lifting off DC-9 clipped the Convair 880. The captain of the DC-9, knowing that he would not be able to climb out, decided to put the airplane back on the runway. The plane came down hard onto the runway, ripping the right landing gear off. The plane hit so hard that the DC-9 made a gouge in the runway. The plane came to a stop, and the plane burst into flames. Through the fog, the controller saw a flash, but they could not see the plane burning. Looking at the radar screen, they saw that the DC-9 was nowhere to be found. Putting two and two together, the controller tries to contact the plane on the departure frequency. No response. Fearing the worst, they sound the crash alarm. Seconds later, they get transmissions from pilots letting them know that something was burning down the runway. Amid all of this chaos, no one realizes that Flight 954 is still on runway 14 left, stricken after having been hit by another plane. The Convair 880 was mostly spared. The taking off DC-9 had clipped its tail and ripped it clean off. The rear of the plane had rubber residue on it, presumably from the landing gear of the DC-9. The back portion of the fuselage of the Convair 880 had been dented in 3 separate places. It was so bad that the ceiling of the back of the cabin had been compressed in by 38 inches. The Convair had a lucky escape, to be honest. It had just been hit by another plane, and all it had to show for it were 3 dents. albeit massive ones. Think about it. Had the crew of the DC-9 lifted off just a few microseconds later than they did, the DC-9 would have slammed into the back of the convair, and the damage would have been much, much worse. Despite the convair being so lucky, the same cannot be said for the DC-9. 10 people aboard the DC-9 perished. Looking back on the crash, it is evident that it was hard for either crew to avoid the accident. They wouldn't have seen each other until they were about 2,000 feet apart, and at the speeds that the DC-9 was at, it would have been almost impossible to avoid the collision. Listening to the CVR of the DC-9, they see that the captain called rotate at 600 and 3 seconds, and he saw the convair at 600 and 7 seconds, to which the captain said, pull her up. In about the span of 5.3 seconds, the captain had to see the convair, evaluate the possibility of a collision, formulate an evasive maneuver, and then put it into action. The investigation found that there was no way the DC-9 could have maintained flight, and the crew's airmanship saved many lives. But why had two planes ended up on an active runway? This should never happen. The investigators zero in on the communications between the convair crew and the ATC. The confusion probably started when the crew of the convair listened to the ATIS message. The message tells the crew that 14 right and 14 left were being used for departures. But later, runway 27 left, the runway on which the accident occurred, was put into service as a departure runway. The crew of the convair had no idea that now runway 27 was an active runway. Once the convair had landed, the controller asked it to report when clear of the departure end of the runway. As all of this was happening, the convair contacts ground and says, Delta 954 is with you and we gotta get to the box. The board finds that the controller never heard the words inside the bridge. Had the controller heard the words inside the bridge, he would have had to ask the plane to turn around and head towards the terminal. As he gave the taxi instructions, the controller makes a note to himself, saying that the convair was holding at pad 32 right. When the crew responded, okay, we'll do it, it just reinforces his idea that the crew will be at pad 32 right, when in fact they're heading for pad 32 left on the other side of the airport across an active runway. So right now, the crew of Delta 954 and the controller have two very different pictures of what's happening. The controller thinks the plane will be at pad 32 right, while the crew think that they're supposed to head over to pad 32 left, because the controller asked them to go to pad 32. And since they were on the bridge taxiway, the only logical option for the crew was pad 32 left. The investigators looked into why the controller might have not heard the transmission inside the bridge. Listening to the tapes, the phrase inside the bridge was recorded and was also intelligible. The controller later stated that his intention was to guide the plane to 32 right, and he thought that the plane had just gotten off runway 14 left when they made the transmission. But the crew had already told the controller that they were clear of the runway more than a minute ago, so it's unclear how the controller thought that the crew were just getting off the runway. Usually at Chicago, when a plane gets off a runway, it was standard practice to taxi along the taxiway as they contacted the tower to get their taxi clearances. The crew should have also been more vigilant when the controller asked them to head for pad 32. They should have clarified if it was pad 32 right or 32 left. It turns out that behavior like this was standard at Ohare. Pilots and controllers often used phraseology and terminology that was not standard in an attempt to increase efficiency. They said that in an airport like Ohare, with so much traffic, deviation in communications was necessary to deal with the traffic there. In this case, a simple misunderstanding led to two planes slamming into each other. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. A big thank you to My Lost Airplane fan for letting me use his amazing videos on my video. I'll see you guys next time.